The Grand Council chamber of the Quadrant Alliance was about as inviting as a dentist's chair during a root canal. It wasn't the lavish domed ceiling or the holographic constellations floating about that made it so. No, it was the fact that it was full of enough alien dignitaries to fill an intergalactic zoo, all of whom had agendas sharper than their teeth, or mandibles, or whatever passed for mouth parts around here. Ambassador Rylan Veers stood at the center, a tiny figure in a really big room, clutching a datapad as if it was his ticket out of a bad comedy club. He was surrounded by representatives from the other races, their eyes, or equivalent sensory organs, trained on him with the intensity of vultures eyeing a limping gazelle. Honored representatives, Veers began, wishing he could start with something less nauseating, like a joke about the weather on a neutron star. I stand here today to address the recent disturbances in subspace territories. Specifically the enthusiastic incursions by the Zithorics. The Zithorics representative, a creature resembling a cross between a praying mantis and a nightmare, twitched its antennae in what Veers hoped was annoyance. Enthusiastic, it clicked in a voice that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. A quaint euphemism for aggressive expansionism, Ambassador Veers. Veers smiled, which in diplomatic terms meant he bared his teeth like a cornered housecat. Yes, well, humans have always prided themselves on their grasp of understatement. Our situation, however, is quite dire. The other representatives, a motley crew of different species, exchanged glances. Some had eyes on stalks, others had more eyes than any living thing ought to, and a few didn't have anything resembling eyes at all. Veers gave them a second to process his statement. He figured it was only polite. Humanity is, shall we say, struggling to hold our territories, Veers continued, with the solemnity of a man announcing the cancellation of a beloved sitcom. Our forces are stretched thin. The Zithorics have proved to be more than a match for us. A snort came from the corner where the representative of the Glaro collective sat. The Glaro were essentially sentient boulders with the personality to match. Perhaps your pride has been your downfall, human, it rumbled. You overestimate your capabilities. Pride us. Veers let out a laugh that was mostly air. No, we just like to keep things interesting. But right now, interesting is turning into a euphemism for really bloody awful. Across the room, the Beryllian delegate, a creature that looked like someone had stuffed a jellyfish into a business suit, pulsed with bioluminescent skepticism. Your message, Ambassador, seems to suggest a plea for assistance, yet you are known for your resilience. Resilience. Oh, we're stubborn as hell, Veers conceded, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. But right now, we're a bit like a cat that's used up 8 of its 9 lives. The Zithoric's ambassador clacked its mandibles, a sound that Veers could only describe as the auditory equivalent of stepping on a Lego in the dark. Then, admit your defeat. Relinquish your territories. Veers shook his head, a calculated movement that spoke more than words. Defeat. Oh, we've embraced defeat like an old friend. We just don't plan on staying friends for long, not when there's still hope for a miraculous comeback. The room buzzed with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. It was a dance they were all familiar with, the humans always down but never quite out. Besides, Veers added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, you wouldn't want us out of the game. The Zithorics love a power vacuum, and they'd happily fill it with their horde. The mention of a Zithorics-dominated quadrant sent a ripple through the assembly. Even the Glaro's rocky facade seemed to crack a little in concern. Veers pounced on the hesitation like a cat on a laser dot. So, honored representatives, perhaps there's a mutually beneficial arrangement to be had, one that keeps the playing field level, if you catch my drift. The room was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant agreement, more like the kind that precedes a brawl at a bar. You propose an alliance then, the Beryllian hummed, its iridescent glow flickering with interest. An alliance, Veers chuckled, a sound that was somewhere between genuine humor and a cough. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, more like a gentle nudge in each other's favor. We help you, you help us. And together we keep the Zethorics from turning this quadrant into their private ant farm. The Zethorics ambassador clicked its mandibles again, but this time Veers thought he caught a note of uncertainty. And what if we decline, human? Veers leaned back, letting a smirk play across his face. Then you get what you want, I suppose. A weakened humanity struggling on its own. But remember, this quadrant gets very quiet without us around to make noise. The threats hung in the air like the faint smell of burnt toast, unpleasant but hard to ignore. The Glaro grunted, a sound like an avalanche in slow motion. We shall deliberate on your proposition. Veers nodded, doing his best to look gracious rather than like he'd just been told to wait outside the principal's office. Deliberate away. Just keep in mind that the Zethorics aren't known for their patience or their manners. As the assembly began its deliberations, Veers allowed himself a moment to breathe. The tension was almost tangible, a living thing that coiled around him like a boa constrictor with trust issues. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humans were never as weak as they appeared. Outside the main hall, Veers found a moment of peace, which in this place meant only a mild sense of impending doom. His aide, a young woman named Lynn, approached with a datapad of her own. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice the kind of deadpan that usually accompanies a bad weather report. "About as well as expected," Veers replied. "Imagine a stand-up routine where the comedian gets pelted with rotten fruit, except the fruit is my pride and it's all gone bad." Lynn nodded, scrolling through her datapad with the intense focus of a cat watching a laser pointer. "Think they'll go for it?" "Go for it. Hell, I think they're more likely to shove us off a cliff and wave cheerily as we fall," Veers muttered. "But we've got to keep them thinking we're on the edge of collapse. That way they won't see what we're really up to." Lynn gave him a sideways look, equal parts admiration and skepticism. "You mean hoping the Zethorics don't get their claws too deep before we can turn this around?" Veers winked. "Exactly. Always keep him guessing. It's the human way." They stood together in uneasy silence, the hum of the council chamber a distant backdrop. Rylan Veers, human ambassador and professional juggler of truth, darkly mused on their predicament. He knew the aliens were playing their own games, and the humans were just one piece on a much larger board. "So what's next?" Lynn asked, breaking the silence and pulling Veers from his reverie. "Next, we wait," Veers replied, with the confidence of a man who's bluffed his way into a poker championship. "And hope they take the bait. One thing's for sure, we're not going down without a fight." The council chamber doors creaked open, spilling out a few of the more frustrated delegates. The deliberations had begun, and Veers knew it would be a long night of political maneuvering and thinly veiled threats. But if humans were good at anything, it was surviving against the odds. He turned to Lynn, his expression a mix of determination and resignation. "Get some coffee. I have a feeling we're going to need it." And as they headed back into the fray, Veers couldn't help but smile. In the darkest corners of space, where foes circled like sharks and allies were few, humanity had one trick up its sleeve that no one else did. An absurd, reckless hope that just might be crazy enough to work. The Grand Council chamber buzzed with the hum of intergalactic tension. The air was thick with the scent of politics, sharp, tangy, with a hint of desperation. Ambassador Rylan Veers stood at the focal point of this cosmic circus, trying to keep his expression as unperturbed as possible. It wasn't easy when the Zethorics representative was sitting across from him like a smug mantis at a fly convention. Commander Zelthar, the aforementioned mantis nightmare, clicked its mandibles in a way that made it seem like it was chewing on the remnants of yet another human defeat. "Ambassador Veers," it began, its voice a haunting melody of nails screeching against plate armor, "we find your proposition amusing, but ultimately futile." Veers forced a grin that felt like it belonged more at a dentist's office than a diplomatic chamber. "Futile's my middle name, Commander. But I've got a first name, and it's persistent." The room's occupants exchanged glances, a veritable kaleidoscope of eyeballs, feelers, and other sensory apparatus that could only be described as innovative to the point of absurdity. The creatures here were more diverse than Veer's collection of bad habits, and each seemed to harbor their own agenda. Zelthar continued, "Our recent victories have only strengthened our resolve. Your territories grow ever smaller, human." Veers nodded with the solemnity of a man acknowledging an unpleasant truth at a funeral. "Yes, like a snowball in hell or my last pay raise." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table in a manner that was casual enough to imply comfort, but focused enough to relay intent. "But here's the thing, Commander, humanity's always been at its best when cornered." Behind the facade of diplomatic banter, a different conversation was brewing. The Zethorics thought they had the upper hand, and maybe they did. But humans weren't just going to roll over and play dead. They were going to roll over and play possum, a much more strategic choice. Veer's eyes flitted over to the Beryllian delegate, who was pulsating with a curious shade of intrigue. "You talk big, Ambassador. What do you have to offer that could interest us in entertaining such a nudge?" "Survival, for one," Veers quipped. "Not just yours, but yours as well." The Zethorics aren't exactly known for their hospitality, unless you count forced labor camps as charming getaways. If an alien diplomatic chamber could feel like a backroom poker game, this was it. Everyone was trying to read each other, figure out who was bluffing and who had a royal flush in their tentacles. Veers was playing both sides, a risky maneuver, but it wasn't like humanity had much left to lose. Finally, Zelthar leaned back, its exoskeleton creaking like the timbers of a haunted house. "We shall see, Ambassador," it said, voice dripping with condescension. "But know this, should your little alliance fail, the Zethorics will not hesitate to feast upon the remnants." Veers gave a crooked smile, channeling all the charm of a used spacecraft dealer with a quota to meet. "Well, Commander, I hope you bring condiments, because humans are notoriously chewy." With that, the formalities drew to a close, and the council dissolved into smaller groups, each faction retreating to their respective corners to deliberate the day's events. Veers took a moment to breathe out the tension before he and Lynn slipped down one of the more shadowy corridors. There was work to be done. They stopped in front of a nondescript door, blending in seamlessly with the dull metallic walls. Lynn gave a quick series of knocks, a code known only to their clandestine allies. The door slid open with a hiss that sounded vaguely like mechanical laughter. Inside was a small room, more bunker than office, where a group of equally weary humans awaited. There was Lieutenant Sykes, a man whose resting face was a permanent state of mild irritation, and Dr. Min, a scientist with a penchant for caffeine and bad jokes. "Welcome back, fearless leader," Sykes said, his voice soaked in sarcasm. "How did the circus go?" Veers shrugged, throwing himself into a chair with the enthusiasm of a man resigned to his fate. "About as well as a spacewalk without a suit, but they are listening. We've got their attention, which is more than I can say for my last stand-up gig." Dr. Min peered over her spectacles, which somehow managed to look out of place and perfectly fitting at the same time. "So, what's the plan, boss?" "The plan," Veers echoed, savoring the moment. "The Zethorics think they're playing us, but they don't realize they're the mouse and we're the cat playing dead. We're gonna lure them right into our trap," Sykes grunted. "Sounds risky. Risky like juggling plasma grenades risky. Is there any other kind of risky?" Veers countered. "We need to keep them overconfident, make them believe they are invincible. Meanwhile, we hit them where it hurts." Lynn leaned in, her expression earnest in a way that made Veers wonder if she'd been paying attention at all. "And what if they call our bluff?" "Then," said Veers with a nonchalance that was only slightly feigned, "we improvise. Humanity's greatest skill." The room fell silent, each person wrapped in their own thoughts. The plan was audacious, borderline insane, and yet it was the best shot they had. If it worked, they'd not only fend off the Zethorics but also secure their place in the galaxy. If it failed, well, there were worse things than being devoured by space bugs, right? "All right," Veers said, clapping his hands together as if signaling the end of a particularly unproductive meeting. Let's make sure our operatives are ready. The moment the Zethorics take the bait, we move in. And remember, keep our real strength under wraps. We want them confident, not cautious. Doctor. Min nodded, her fingers already flying over her datapad with the grace of a concert pianist playing Flight of the Bumblebee. I'll make sure our tech is ready. If anyone's going to make noise, it'll be us. Sykes stood, stretching in a way that reminded Veers of a lion waking from a nap. I'll coordinate with our field teams. Make sure they're ready to strike when the time comes. Lynn checked her own datapad, her face set in determination. And I'll handle comms. Make sure nobody blows our cover before it's time. Veers looked around the room at the eclectic team of misfits and geniuses and felt a surge of hope. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't entirely sure he trusted, but in this moment it was enough. All right then, he said, standing up and straightening his suit as best as he could. Let's give the galaxy a show they'll never forget. As they exited the room, Veers felt the weight of the mission settle back onto his shoulders. The stakes were monumental, and failure was a specter that loomed ever-present. But if humanity was good at anything, it was pulling victory from the jaws of defeat, even if those jaws were filled with razor-sharp alien teeth. Back in the main chamber, the delegates were still debating, their voices a cacophony of languages and dialects that turned the air into a symphony of chaos. Veers rejoined the fray, slipping back into the role of diplomat with the ease of a man slipping into a well-worn coat. The Glaro representative was rumbling something about stability in the quadrant when Veers tuned in, nodding along as if he actually believed in the notion. Stability was a pipe dream, a mirage in this desert of distrust and ambition. But it was a nice thought, and in the absence of better options, Veers was willing to indulge it. The Beryllian delegate continued to flicker with interest, its bioluminescence casting odd shadows across the chamber. Ambassador Veers, you speak of maintaining balance, yet you offer little in terms of tangible guarantees. Veers smiled, a practiced diplomatic expression that hid the chaos of his thoughts. Here's a guarantee. Keep us around and the Zethorics don't get free reign over the quadrant. Hedge your bets. Besides, you wouldn't want to miss out on our stellar cuisine. I hear our space rations are to die for. The room rippled with what might have been amusement or digestive discomfort. It was hard to tell with aliens. The Zethoric's ambassador remained silent, its gaze unwavering, a reminder of the threat they posed. Veers leaned back slightly, letting the conversation flow around him like water around a rock. The debates would continue, the arguments and counterarguments a complex dance that could last Ior's days even. But Rylan Veers was patient and he had a plan. In the darkest corners of space, where alliances were as fleeting as shooting stars, humanity was poised to make its stand. With luck, cunning, and a little bit of that reckless hope, they might just pull it off. And if not, well, at least they'd go down swinging. As Lynn returned with a steaming mug of the finest swill that passed for coffee in these parts, Veers took a sip and grimaced. It was bitter, strong enough to strip paint, and exactly what he needed. Well, he murmured to himself, surveying the chaos of the chamber, let's see how this plays out. In the end, it was all just another day in the life of the galaxy's most resilient underdogs, and if anyone could turn the tide against impossible odds, it was humanity. With a wry smile, Veers settled in for the long haul, ready to ride this bumpy ride wherever it might lead. The Grand Council chamber buzzed with the nervous energy of 1,000 diplomats trying desperately to show they weren't sweating through their ceremonial robes. Somewhere in the chorus of alien discussions, Rylan Veers caught a snippet of conversation about the most recent skirmish at the edge of human-controlled space. The news had spread like a juicy piece of gossip at a school reunion, and the reactions were predictably varied. Some laughed, some cried, and some just stared blankly, like they'd walked in on a family argument. Veers, however, snorted at the idea of it all. The Zethorics had decided to poke the bear, or whatever metaphor best described humanity these days. He sat among a throng of delegates, the center of a storm he was trying to control without letting on he didn't have a damn clue what the forecast was. His datapad blinked silently with the latest updates, each one more grim than the last. The Zethorics had hit a remote human outpost, and as far as first impressions go, they'd nailed it. The outpost was in shambles, reduced to what could best be described as space confetti. But Veers had a hunch, a sneaking suspicion that things weren't all doom and gloom. Call it intuition or just his ever-optimistic cynicism. "I see your species has been prioritizing interior decorating again," Zelthar remarked, sidling up with the kind of grin that made the skin crawl, not that Zelthar had any skin to speak of. Veers feigned a chuckle, as if he were sharing a joke over drinks in some dingy bar rather than discussing the potential extinction of humankind. "You know us humans, always looking to make a big impression. You should come see it up close, though I hear the accommodations are a bit airy these days." Zelthar's mandibles clicked in what could have been an attempt at laughter or a sign it was hungry. Hard to say with these space mantises. "Your bravado is admirable, Ambassador, but bravado alone does not win wars." "True," Veers replied, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, "but it makes for great stories. And everyone loves a good underdog tale." Their exchange was interrupted by Lynn, who sidled up with a look that screamed urgency. "Ambassador, we've got a situation," she whispered, not quite hiding her impatience. "Well, go on. Don't keep me in suspense," Veers muttered, keeping his voice low enough that only Lynn could hear. "The outpost," she said, her voice tinged with the sort of seriousness that was as rare as a positive news report. "There's more to it than we thought. Command thinks it might have been a trap." Veers raised an eyebrow. "A trap for us or them?" "That's the thing," Lynn replied, casting a quick glance at the alien dignitaries, who seemed more interested in their own chatter than humanity's plight. "We're not sure yet. But Command wants to pull some strings, make it seem like we're more vulnerable than we are." Veers considered this, the wheels in his head turning with the speed of a particularly lethargic snail. It was a dangerous game, showing weakness to bait the enemy. But then again, humanity had never been the cautious type. "Tell them to proceed, but keep it quiet. We want the Zethorics overconfident, not curious." Lynn nodded, her expression one of bemused admiration. "You've got a lot of faith in this plan, Ambassador." "No faith at all, actually," Veers shot back, his tone dry. "But it's the best bad idea we've got." As Lynn melted back into the crowd, Veers allowed himself a moment to ponder the implications. Humanity was hanging by a thread. But then again, they'd always had a knack for unexpectedly pulling victory from the jaws of defeat, after the jaws had already clamped down, given them a good shake, and thrown them across the room. The council's discussions meandered on, speakers taking the floor to voice concerns, grievances, and, occasionally, absurdly optimistic proposals that were shot down faster than they could be voiced. Veers tuned it out, mulling over humanity's position on the galactic chessboard. It was precarious, like trying to juggle grenades with the pins already pulled. Just as his mind started to drift into the abyss, Sykes appeared, looking every bit like a man who had just swallowed a particularly bitter pill. "Ambassador," he said, his voice cutting through the din like a well-aimed laser, "the Zethorics are demanding an explanation for the skirmish." Veers let out a long-suffering sigh. "Of course they are. Can't have a good old-fashioned shelling without someone wanting to know why their neighbor's lawn is now a crater." Sykes crossed his arms, a gesture that conveyed skepticism, frustration, and a hint of constipation. "What's the play here, sir?" "The play," Veers said, savoring the word like a fine wine, or at least a passable imitation thereof, "is to do what humans do best, improvise. We let them think we're scrambling, then we hit back hard when they least expect it." Sykes snorted, an expression that could have been mistaken for amusement had it not been followed by a frown. "So business as usual then?" "Exactly," Veers replied, a glint in his eye as he surveyed the chaos around him. Let's keep them guessing. If they want a show, we'll give them the performance of a lifetime. Back on the fringes of human space, where the debris of the outpost still floated like a macabre constellation, humanity's operatives were already at work. In the murky depths of the cosmos, teams moved with a silent efficiency that would have impressed a ghost in the night. Lieutenant Adler, a woman whose sharp wit was matched only by her sharper aim, led the charge. Her team was tasked with ensuring the Zethorics saw exactly what they wanted them to see: a panicked, vulnerable human contingent scrambling to regroup. "Let's make this look good, people," Adler said, her voice crackling over the comms like static on a broken radio. "We want them thinking we're on the verge of collapse, so put on your best we're so screwed faces." The operatives went to work, making deliberate mistakes, leaving trails that screamed of desperation. It was an act worthy of any stage, an illusion that played to the enemy's overconfidence like a finely tuned instrument. They were the magicians, and the Zethorics, their unwitting audience. As the minutes ticked by, the operatives moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, executing their parts with the kind of discipline that came from years of training, and perhaps a little bit of madness. They knew the stakes, and they knew the risks. But above all, they knew that the smallest slip could cost them everything. Back in the council chamber, the air was thick with tension, with every delegate vying for dominance in a game where the rules changed on a whim. Veers was in his element, navigating the discussions with all the grace of a dancer trying not to trip over their own feet. The latest report from the skirmish played out in his mind like a horror movie on repeat, but beneath the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope, a plan that, if executed perfectly, could turn the tide. It was a gamble, but isn't all diplomacy just a roll of the cosmic dice? As the session wore on, Veers found himself locked in a verbal joust with Zelthar once more. The Zethoric's representative was in rare form, exuding confidence and predatory intent like an interstellar shark that smelled blood in the water. "Your species," Zelthar drawled, "is like a cornered animal lashing out in desperation." Veers met the creature's gaze unflinchingly. "That's the thing about cornered animals, Zelthar," he said, his voice steady. "They've got nothing left to lose, and that's when they are at their most dangerous." Zelthar's mandibles twitched, an involuntary gesture that could have meant anything from annoyance to indigestion. "Careful, Ambassador. Bluffing has its limits." "It's not bluffing when you're holding the last ace," Veers replied with a cocky grin that hid his own uncertainty. As the council session began to wind down, the delegates dispersed, leaving Veers alone with his thoughts and a datapad that seemed to be mocking him with its incessant updates. The skirmish had rattled the alliance, but it had also opened a door, a chance to turn misfortune into fortune, failure into triumph. Veers knew the risks, knew the odds were stacked against them. But he also knew the resilience of humanity, the stubborn determination that defined them. They were the cosmic underdogs, and if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was defying expectations. With a final glance around the emptying chamber, Veers stood and prepared to leave. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the next act was about to begin. As he stepped into the corridor, he couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. In the grand scheme of things, humanity might be the cosmic joke, but they were damn good at playing the punchline. Ambassador Rylan Veers sat in the Grand Council chamber, a room that could double as a set for an extravagant space opera or a particularly hostile business meeting. The ceiling, with its holographic constellations, hung overhead like a reminder that the universe was vast, indifferent, and ready to kick humanity while it was down. Veers didn't have the luxury of mulling over existential dread. The Zethorics were pressing their advantage, and the council was buzzing with tension, like a nest of angry hornets, or whatever kind of unholy insects the Zethorics might spawn. Commander Zelthar was back at it, holding court with the confidence of someone who knew they had the upper hand. His mandibles clicked rhythmically, a sound that was somewhere between a bad metronome and a haunted wind chime. Ambassador Veers, your species continues to resist in the most inventive ways. Yeah, well, we humans have always been praised for our creativity, Veers shot back, leaning in as though sharing a secret. Especially when it comes to getting out of tight spots. Think of it as a survival mechanism. Zelthar's equivalent of eyebrows arched, though Veers wasn't entirely sure what that motion meant. We shall see how far your creativity takes you when our fleet arrives at your outpost. Veers hid a wince, playing it off with a shrug. I'm sure they'll enjoy the view. Heard it's lovely this time of year, what with the exploding debris and all. The Zethoric's commander seemed satisfied, his posture straightening, his mandibles clicking a few times in what was probably intended as a farewell. Veers watched him go, resisting the urge to flip him off, a gesture that might get lost in translation, but would likely send the wrong message to the intergalactic gallery. Sykes sidled up, looking like he'd been chewing on a particularly sour lemon. The Zethorics are pushing a fleet towards Outpost Alpha, Sykes said, his voice low, as if speaking any louder might summon the damn thing faster. Veers pinched the bridge of his nose. Because of course they are. Great. Just fantastic. What about the Council? Any hope of wrangling some support? Depends on your definition of hope, Sykes replied, eyes scanning the room. The sergeants seem receptive, but they are more interested in selling us weapons than anything else. The Cathar are on the fence, which is an improvement over actively rooting for our demise. Veers nodded, considering the options. All right, time to dole out some desperate pleas and heartfelt speeches. You know, the usual. It was classic diplomacy, or at least the kind Veers was accustomed to. Paint the picture of humanity as the underdog, backed into a corner by the big, bad Zethorics. Sprinkle in some sincerity, a dash of melodrama, and hope that someone cared enough to throw them a bone. He moved to the podium, clearing his throat in a way that suggested he'd swallowed a handful of gravel. Esteemed members of the Council, we stand at a pivotal moment, he began, resisting the urge to roll his eyes at his own words. The Zethoric's fleet is descending on one of our key outposts, an outpost which, might I add, poses no threat to them. There was a murmur of interest, or maybe Veers was imagining it. Either way, he pressed on. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for a chance to show that peace is a better solution than annihilation. Nobody benefits from a galaxy-wide war, except maybe the Undertakers. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, and Veers latched onto them like a lifeline. Intervention now could prevent escalation. It could mean the difference between a future spent in collaboration or one spent picking up the pieces from a war nobody wants. He stepped back, letting the silence settle. It was a gamble, leveraging their weakness to cajole the Council into action. But Veers was used to gambling with bad odds. Humanity had survived on that kind of lunacy for centuries. As Veers returned to his seat, Sykes leaned in. Think anyone bought it? Veers smirked. If they didn't, I'll just start singing sad songs and guilt-trip them into submission. And here I thought your speeches were already punishment enough, Sykes quipped, earning a weary chuckle from Veers. As the Council began their deliberations, Veers caught sight of Lynn approaching, her face set with the kind of determination that suggested news, good or bad. Ambassador, we've got a problem, she said, her voice low and urgent. Just one? I guess today's looking up, Veers replied, trying and failing to keep the sarcasm out of his tone. What is it? She handed him a datapad, the screen flickering with a transmission log. This got leaked. Someone's suggesting we've got a secret weapon, something that could turn the tide if deployed. Veers stared at the datapad, an eyebrow quirking upwards. Please tell me it's not another rumor about those earthling death rays everyone seems to think we have. Afraid not, Lynn replied. This one's got legs. Some chatter about a possible technological edge we're keeping under wraps. Veers exhaled sharply, the air leaving his lungs like a punctured balloon. Perfect. Just what we need, rumors of a card we don't even have in our hand. Lynn nodded, glancing around the room. It's causing a stir. Some factions might see this as a reason to back us, thinking we've got more in our arsenal. Others, well, they'll be sharpening their knives, hoping to carve us up and take whatever they think we're hiding, Veers finished, rubbing his temples. The headache that had been simmering in the background all day finally made its unwelcome presence known. He glanced at the council, the dignitaries who held the fate of humanity in their hands. They were like sharks in a feeding frenzy, each one looking for the slightest hint of weakness, the smallest drop of blood in the water. Veers knew he had to act, to turn this potential disaster into something resembling an opportunity. It was like trying to juggle a live grenade, but when had that ever stopped him before? "All right, Lin," he said, his voice carrying a resigned determination. "Let's spin this. Make them think we've got something worth betting on. If we're going down, might as well go down swinging." Lin gave a nod, a smile ghosting across her features. "You sure you're not part gambler, ambassador?" Veers chuckled, the sound dry and brittle. "I think I'd make a terrible gambler, but here we are, betting on the galaxy's worst odds. Let's see if we can't convince them we're worth the risk." The council was in chaos, delegates chattering like hyperactive squirrels, their faces animated by the prospect of a new development. The leak had stirred the pot, and now, the question was whether it would tip the scales in humanity's favor or push them off the edge entirely. Veers stood again, clearing his throat with the kind of gravitas that demanded attention, or maybe just suggested he was about to choke on his own words. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it seems there are rumors circulating about a theoretical advantage we may possess. Let me assure you, humanity has always thrived on innovation and ingenuity." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a particularly audacious claim. "We won't deny or confirm these rumors, but let me pose a question. If we do have such an ace up our sleeve, wouldn't you rather be with us than against us when the cards are finally laid on the table?" There was a ripple of interest, a shift in the atmosphere that Veers could almost feel down to his bones. He could see the gears turning in the minds of his audience, each delegate weighing their options, considering the potential fallout of their decisions. Some faces were encouraging, others were inscrutable masks of contemplation. Veers couldn't tell if they were thinking about potential alliances or simply wondering if humanity had finally lost its collective marbles. Zelthar, ever the opportunist, was among those watching with keen interest. His alien visage betrayed nothing, and yet Veers knew the Zethoric's commander was recalculating possibilities, figuring out how best to play his own hand. As the council resumed its discourse, Veers returned to his seat, Sykes joining him with a look that was part admiration, part confusion. "Not bad, Ambassador. Though I'm not sure if you just saved us or hastened our demise." "Let's call it a little bit of both," Veers replied with a lopsided grin. "Besides, I'm getting used to the whole existential dread thing. It's like having a permanent cloud hanging overhead, but at least it keeps the sunburn away." Sykes snorted, shaking his head. "You sure know how to make diplomatic negotiations exciting. If we survive this, you should write a book." Veers chuckled, the sound mingling with the tense atmosphere of the chamber. "Maybe I will, Sykes, maybe I will, but for now let's focus on not becoming footnotes in someone else's history book." The council continued, the stakes escalating with every passing moment. Humanity's fate hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a knife. But if there was one thing Veers knew, it was that humans had a knack for clinging to that edge longer than anyone expected. In the midst of chaos, that was the one certainty he could hold on to. Ambassador Rylan Veers felt like a man trying to light a cigarette in a hurricane. The Grand Council chamber swirled with chaos, a cacophony of voices rising like a chorus of angry space crows. The Zethoric's fleet was bearing down on Outpost Alpha, and the sense of impending doom was as palpable as the hangover he was nursing from the night before. He glanced over at Sykes, who was watching the council's pandemonium with a look that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. maybe in the vacuum of space without a suit. And he bets on how long it takes before someone suggests we just roll over and play dead. Sykes snorted, shaking his head. I give it 10 minutes, 15 tops, longer than you lasted with that bottle last night. Veers rubbed his temples, trying to knead away the persistent throb that had settled there like an unwelcome squatter. I just wanted a quiet evening. Who knew diplomacy would be such a brutal drinking game? The council was in full swing now, voices raised and hands, or whatever appendages they had, gesticulating wildly. Veers watched with a mixture of detached amusement and genuine concern. It was like watching a group of toddlers argue over a broken toy, except these toddlers could vaporize planets. And then there was Zelthar standing smugly amidst the chaos, his mandibles twitching in something that might have been the Zethoric's equivalent of a smirk. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was enough to remind everyone exactly who held the advantage. Veers leaned over to Sykes. Remind me why we haven't just shoved him out an airlock yet. Sykes shrugged. Because we're the civilized ones, remember. Even if he makes us want to redefine the word. Veers sighed, turning his attention back to the council. The debate was going nowhere fast, and the Zethoric's fleet was getting closer with every passing second. Humanity's last hope seemed to be slipping through their fingers like sand through a sieve. But there was still one card left to play, one gamble that might just tilt the odds in their favor. And like any good gamble, it involved a fair amount of bluffing and a willingness to risk everything. Veers stood, silencing the chamber with a gesture. The sudden quiet was a shock to the system, like stepping out of a roaring storm into eerie calm. Esteemed members, it's clear that reasoning with the Zethorics is about as effective as reasoning with a brick wall. No offense intended to any brick-based life forms present. There was a ripple of laughter, and Veers grabbed hold of it like a lifeline. But humanity has a plan, he continued, injecting a note of confidence into his voice that he didn't quite feel. A plan that requires your trust and support. The murmurs started up again, and Veers could almost see the wheels turning in the minds of the council members. It was like watching a poker game where everyone was bluffing and everyone knew it. Zelthar's eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, narrowed, his attention fully focused on Veers. The ambassador could feel the weight of that gaze, the scrutiny, as if Zelthar was trying to peel back the layers of his mind to see the truth beneath. Good luck with that, Veers thought. Even I don't know what we're doing half the time. Behind the scenes, Lynn and her team were setting the stage for the riskiest maneuver humanity had ever attempted. It was a plan born of desperation, the kind of plan that only seemed good after several stiff drinks and a pep talk from a half-crazed optimist. The Zethoric's fleet was approaching Outpost Alpha, their ships a menacing shadow against the cosmos. The outpost's defenses, such as they were, had already been breached, and reports coming in painted a grim picture. It was a massacre, plain and simple, and humanity was on the losing side. But the outpost wasn't just a target, it was bait. Bait for a trap that required perfect timing and more than a little luck. Veers's datapad buzzed, a message from Lynn flashing across the screen. He read it quickly, a smile twitching at the corners of his mouth despite the dire circumstances. Looks like the show is about to start, he muttered to Sykes, who raised an eyebrow. Got something up your sleeve, Ambassador, or is it just a particularly ambitious mosquito? Veers chuckled, low and dark. Let's just say we're about to give the Zethorics a taste of good old human ingenuity. The Iors dragged by, each one feeling like a small eternity. Veers watched the council continue its dance of pointless debates and empty promises, all while the clock ticked down to 0. And then the moment came. The trap was sprung, the culmination of countless hours of planning and a fair bit of blind hope. The Zethorics, expecting an easy victory, were in for a surprise. As their fleet descended on Outpost Alpha, they triggered a series of dormant defense mechanisms, experimental tech that had been quietly installed during the outpost's construction. It was a long shot, but it was the kind of insane gamble that humans excelled at. Veers watched the feed with bated breath. The Zethoric ships, caught in the sudden onslaught of auto turrets and EMP bursts, faltered. It wasn't enough to destroy them, but it was enough to sow chaos in their ranks. Sykes let out a low whistle, shaking his head in admiration. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually pulled it off." Veers shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. Never underestimate humanity's ability to pull a rabbit out of a hat at the last possible second. The chamber was alive with noise once more, the delegates reacting to the unexpected turn of events. Some looked relieved, others wary, and a few seemed to be questioning their life choices. Zelthar was as inscrutable as ever, though Veers fancied he saw a flicker of uncertainty in the alien's eyes. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Veers took his seat, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd bought themselves some time, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. Sykes leaned over, his expression a mix of awe and exasperation. "You know, if you keep this up, you might actually start to believe in your own hype." Veers grinned, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Who says I don't already?" The Zethoric's fleet was regrouping, their initial shock giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. They were like a wounded beast, more dangerous now than ever, and humanity would need every ounce of cunning and courage to survive the coming storm. But for now, Veers allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd faced their darkest ire and come out swinging, and that was worth celebrating if only for a brief moment. As the council resumed its deliberations, the ambassador couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It was a fragile thing, easily snuffed out, but it was there nonetheless. The universe might be vast and indifferent, but humanity was nothing if not resilient. And while their future was uncertain, one thing was clear: they weren't going down without a fight. Ambassador Ryland Veers was feeling uncomfortably, like he was caught in the middle of a particularly bad joke, one where the punchline was always on him. He glanced around the Grand Council chamber, the chaos still simmering, a pot of discord threatening to boil over at any moment. The Zethoric's fleet was regrouping, but they were about to discover that humanity had more tricks up its sleeve than a crooked card dealer at a galactic poker table. He leaned in towards Sykes, who was doing his best impression of a man caught in a diplomatic hostage situation. "You remember that little surprise we installed out near Outpost Alpha?" Sykes raised an eyebrow, a look of cautious optimism peeking out from under a thick layer of cynicism. "The one you said was like a birthday present we couldn't afford." Veers nodded, a smirk playing across his lips. "Well, it's time to unwrap it." The datapad in his hand buzzed again, this time with a message from Admiral Karth, who was overseeing the Hidden Fleet's operations. Veers read it quickly, his grin spreading as he processed the contents. "Looks like the cavalry's about to arrive." Sykes' eyes widened slightly. "You mean those non-existent ships we've been pretending we lost in a bet to the Zethorics? Those are the ones," Veers said, unable to suppress a chuckle. "Turns out, when you tell enough people your fleet's been decimated, they start believing it, even if you're quietly parking a few ships on the dark side of a moon." Sykes shook his head in disbelief. "You do realize that if this doesn't work, they'll string us up by our own diplomatic immunity, right?" Veers shrugged, a picture of nonchalance amidst the impending chaos. "In for a penny, in for a planet-destroying pound." The chamber was a cacophony of speculation and accusation, voices clashing like a symphony of malfunctioning industrial machinery. But Veers knew this was the moment to make their move. He stood up once more, drawing the attention of the delegates like a reluctant ringmaster coaxing wayward lions back into their cages. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed whatever you are of the council," he began, that same lopsided grin firmly in place. "I have the pleasure of announcing that reports of humanity's demise have been greatly exaggerated." There was a murmur of confusion, the council members exchanging glances like poker players trying to read a bluff. Zelthar's mandibles clicked, a sound that might have been irritation or indigestion. "What are you implying, Ambassador?" Veers gestured expansively, as if unlocking the secrets of the universe with a single wave. "I'm implying that while the Zithorics were busy counting their chickens before they hatched, humanity was busy setting up a fox to guard the henhouse." As if on cue, the holographic display dominating the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing a fleet of human ships emerging from the shadows, their presence a sudden, jarring reality. They appeared like avenging spirits from the deep, engines glowing with the promise of righteous fury, or at least the promise of a solid punch to the Zithorix's smug mandibles. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and satisfying. It was as if Veers had dropped a live grenade into a bucket of confetti. Panic, disbelief, and a grudging respect mixed together in a potent cocktail of chaos. Sykes couldn't resist a low whistle. "You really went and did it, Veers." Veers gave a lazy salute to the screen. "Sometimes the best lies are the ones you can almost believe yourself." Zelthar's alien eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his features. "A clever ruse, Ambassador, but cleverness will not save you in the end." Veers met Zelthar's gaze with steely determination. "Cleverness is the only thing that's ever saved us," he replied. "And right now, it's the only thing standing between you and a very awkward conversation with your superiors about what went wrong." Amidst the pandemonium, a few delegates, those with the sense not to put all their eggs in the Zithorix basket, began to whisper among themselves. Alliances were shifting, the currents of power realigning in the wake of humanity's unexpected resurgence. Veers knew this was the time to capitalize on the confusion. He approached a group of dignitaries who had been sitting on the fence, or perhaps just using it as a convenient seat for the view. "Ladies and gents," he said, sliding into their midst with the practiced ease of a man who could sell sand to a desert dweller. "I think you'll find the future of this quadrant is looking a lot more versatile than previously thought." One of the delegates, a gruff-looking creature with more tentacles than was strictly necessary, eyed Veers suspiciously. "And why should we trust humanity now?" Veers spread his hands wide, the picture of sincerity. "Because when push comes to shove, we're the species that shoves back with a grin. And let's face it, the Zithorics haven't exactly been stellar neighbors." The delegates exchanged glances, and slowly, grudgingly, a few of them nodded. It was the start of something, a fragile alliance formed in the crucible of desperation and opportunity. Meanwhile, the Zithorix fleet was in disarray, the shock of humanity's sudden resurgence throwing them into a tailspin. They were scrambling to regroup, to make sense of a situation that had slipped through their mandibles like vapor. Veers watched the Zithorics struggle with a sort of grim satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And in a universe that seemed hell-bent on grinding humanity down to dust, any victory was worth savoring. Sykes joined him, watching the holographic display with a mix of awe and disbelief. "I can't believe it actually worked," he said, shaking his head. Veers clapped him on the back, a gesture half camaraderie, half relief. "Never underestimate the power of a good bluff, my friend. It's the only thing keeping us from being Galaxy's next snack." The council chamber was a hive of activity, the dynamics shifting as more and more races began to hedge their bets, siding with the underdogs who'd just shown they still had plenty of fight left in them. Veers took a moment to soak in the atmosphere, the chaos and confusion serving as a backdrop to humanity's audacious stand. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd bought themselves precious time. "This is far from over, you realize," Sykes said, his voice low and serious. Veers nodded, the smile slipping from his face for a moment. "I know, but for now we've given them something to think about, and thinking isn't exactly the Zithorix's strong suit." Sykes chuckled, a rare sound given the circumstances. "No, but it looks like they're getting a crash course." Veers turned his attention back to the council, his mind already racing ahead to the next move, the next bluff in a game where the stakes couldn't be higher. "What's next?" Sykes asked, his voice a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Veers grinned, the lopsided smile of a gambler who knows the odds are long but refuses to back down. Next, we keep them guessing. And we keep surviving, one impossible move at a time. The Zethorics would regroup, they always did. But humanity was proving to be a tougher nut to crack than they'd anticipated. And if there was one thing humanity had perfected over centuries of chaos and conflict, it was the art of survival. As the chamber continued to buzz with new alliances and whispered negotiations, Veers felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. It was a fragile thing, easily snuffed out, but it was there nonetheless. In the vast, indifferent universe, humanity had found its voice, and for now at least, that voice was shouting, laughing in the face of oblivion and daring anyone to silence it. Veers knew the fight was far from over, but they'd turned the tide. They'd reminded the universe what it meant to be human, irreverent, clever, and never quite out of the game. And that was worth everything. Ryland Veers adjusted his jacket, the weight of the universe resting heavily on his shoulders, or at least the part that didn't involve ordering lunch. The Grand Council chamber was in full swing, a blend of chaos and barely contained hysteria. It wasn't every day you got to see alien dignitaries collectively lose their minds over humanity's latest trickery. He wondered if any of them realized the real secret was just surviving long enough to see their enemies mess up. Is it just me, or does this feel like the moment in a horror movie where the monster realizes the humans had shotguns all along? Sykes muttered beside him, his voice dripping with sardonic amusement. Veers chuckled, his gaze never leaving the holographic display. More like when the monster finds out we've been waiting with shotguns, flamethrowers, and a bottle of cheap whiskey. The Zethoric's fleet, previously a wall of menace, was now a glorious mess of confusion. Ships darting about like headless chickens, if chickens had advanced propulsion systems and a penchant for destroying planets. It was a ballet of panic, courtesy of a human strategy that revolved around the one thing the galaxy should have known by now: never bet against humanity when we're cornered. Admiral Karth's voice crackled over his earpiece, calm and collected, the kind of voice you'd trust with your life savings or your last beer. Ambassador Veers, the non-existent fleet is engaging the Zethorics. They're not handling the surprise well. Veers grinned, a wolfish twist to his lips. That's the thing about surprises, Admiral. No one ever does. In the council chamber, Zelthar was doing his best impression of a politician getting caught with his hand in the proverbial cookie jar. His mandibles clicked in irritation, a sound that Veers found oddly satisfying. "You think this is over, human?" Zelthar hissed, his alien eyes narrowed to slits. Veers looked at him, the kind of look you'd give someone who just insisted on playing another round of Russian roulette. "Not over, Zelthar. Just getting started. You see, humanity's got a knack for turning a bad hand into a winning one." Zelthar's mandibles twitched, perhaps in disbelief or indigestion, hard to tell with these guys. "Cleverness won't save you forever." "True," Veers conceded, shrugging. "But it'll save us today, and that's good enough for me." The chamber was alive with the buzz of desperation and redrawn battle lines. Delegates who'd been staunchly Zethorics a moment ago now looked as shaky as a new recruit on their first day in the trenches. Veers could almost smell the scent of shifting allegiances, a heady mix of fear and opportunism. Sykes leaned over, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You sure this won't backfire spectacularly?" Veers shot him a sideways glance. "If it does, at least we won't be around to hear 'I told you so.'" The holographic display flickered, showing the unfolding dance of destruction as human ships executed maneuvers that defied logic and probably several laws of physics. Veers had to admit, there was a certain poetry in watching the Zethorics' carefully orchestrated plans unravel like a cheap sweater. "Admiral Karth," Veers said, tapping his earpiece with the nonchalance of a man ordering a coffee. "Care to give our friends a little more to chew on?" "With pleasure, Ambassador," Karth replied, the satisfaction in his voice as clear as a blaster shot in a vacuum. Moments later, the human fleet unleashed a barrage of firepower that lit up the display like a particularly violent holiday. Zethoric's ships buckled, their formations shattered under the weight of human ingenuity and sheer bloody-mindedness. Veers turned his attention back to the council chamber, where the tension was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. He gave a little bow, the kind you'd offer after a particularly good magic trick. "Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you're enjoying the show." A delegate with too many eyes and not enough patience scoffed, their voice a low rumble. "Enjoyment isn't quite the word I'd use, Ambassador." Veers shrugged, unfazed. "Well, stick around. We're just getting to the good part." Zelthar, now looking like a bug caught under a particularly unpleasant shoe, snapped at Veers. "This changes nothing. The Zethorics will not be defeated so easily." "No," Veers agreed, his tone deceptively light. "But you'll definitely remember us." In the chaos, Veers caught snippets of conversation, fragments of alliances being reforged in the fires of necessity. Humanity had proven its mettle once again, and the universe was taking note. The old axiom held true: nothing unites like a common enemy, especially one that had been underestimated by pretty much everyone. Sykes was on his second datapad, fingers flying over the device with a speed that suggested caffeine or sheer desperation. "The reports are coming in," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "We're actually turning this around." Veers allowed himself a moment of pride, a brief flicker of triumph tempered by the knowledge that the universe wasn't done with them yet. It's amazing what a little ingenuity and a whole lot of stubbornness can achieve. The council's collective gaze was now firmly on Veers, a mix of admiration, resentment, and the dawning realization that humanity might just be worth betting on after all. "And that, ladies and gentlemen," Veers continued, his voice carrying the weight of history and the promise of a future, "is why you never count humanity out." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, the tides of power shifting as species realigned their loyalties. Humanity's ingenuity, their ability to adapt and survive against the odds, was a force to be reckoned with. Zelthar, for his part, seemed to have deflated somewhat, the fire in his gaze dimming as reality set in. "You may have won this battle, Ambassador, but the war is far from over." Veers nodded, acknowledging the truth in Zelthar's words. "True enough. But for today, that's good enough for me." The council chamber buzzed with a new energy, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there moments before. Humanity had reminded them all that they were more than just a tenacious race clinging to the margins of the galaxy. Veers looked at Sykes, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Fancy a drink after this?" "My treat." Sykes snorted, the sound full of relief and good humor. "If we make it out of here alive, I'll take you up on that." The holographic display showed the Zethoric's fleet in retreat, their once mighty armada reduced to a shadow of its former self. It was a sight that filled Veers with a grim satisfaction, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, humanity could still pull a rabbit out of the hat. As the council began to disperse, delegates eager to reassess their positions in the light of humanity's unexpected triumph, Veers felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of validation that went beyond mere survival. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the universe, humanity had made its mark once again. They defied the odds, stared down death, and come out the other side with their heads held high. Veers took a deep breath, savoring the moment even as he prepared for the challenges ahead. The fight was far from over, but they'd proven they were more than capable of holding their own. "To humanity," Sykes said, raising an imaginary glass in salute. Veers echoed the gesture, his voice filled with defiance and hope. "To humanity. May we always find a way." The universe had thrown its worst at them, and they'd responded with grit, cunning, and an unshakable belief in their ability to endure. They'd shown the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, irreverent, snarky, and never quite out of the game. In the end, they were still standing, still fighting, and still laughing in the face of oblivion. And for Veers, that was more than enough. As he left the council chamber, the echoes of their victory ringing in his ears, Veers knew there would be more battles ahead. But for now, they'd bought themselves time and reminded the universe why it should never underestimate humanity. The future was uncertain, the path fraught with danger, but Veers was ready to face it with the same irreverent spirit that had carried them this far. Because in the grand, chaotic scheme of things, that was what it meant to be human, defiant, clever, and always ready for the next challenge. And with that thought, he stepped into the unknown, a glint of mischief in his eyes and a smirk on his lips, ready to take on whatever came next. Veers leaned back in his chair, the kind that looked comfortable but had, in fact, been designed by someone with a deep-seated hatred for spines everywhere. The council chamber was emptying, the clatter of alien dignitaries hustling out filling the air like 1,000 disgruntled crabs trying to escape a boiling pot. He couldn't help but chuckle at the thought. They'd come in with their smug expressions, ready to see humanity laid out on a platter, only to be treated to a surprise performance of the art of human tenacity. After all, nothing says whoops quite like an unexpected victory. Sykes was still fiddling with his datapad, likely documenting the day's chaos with the fervor of a historian who couldn't believe his luck. "Think they'll put up a statue in your honor, Veers?" he asked, not looking up from his device. Veers snorted. "Sure, right next to the one of the guy who invented the toaster. No one remembers his name either." "Hey, at least you'd have a statue," Sykes shot back, finally setting the datapad aside with a weary sigh. "Most of us just get a nice eulogy or a vague mention during a council meeting." "True," Veers said, massaging his temples. "But heroics are overrated. I'd rather have a drink." With the battle won, at least this battle, the atmosphere had transformed from heavy tension to a sort of cautious optimism, like a gambler who just hit a lucky streak but knew the house always wins in the end. Veers watched as the last of the delegates slunk out, no doubt planning their next moves with all the enthusiasm of a rat navigating a minefield. Admiral Karth's voice crackled through Veers' earpiece again, a calm anchor in the storm of galactic politics. "Any fallout I need to be aware of, Ambassador?" "Plenty," Veers replied, his tone dry as a Martian desert. "We're suddenly everyone's favorite underdog, which brings its own set of headaches. We'll be getting invitations to parties we didn't even know existed." "Good," Karth said. "Means we've shaken things up." "Yeah, it's all fun and games until someone loses a planet," Veers muttered, though he couldn't keep the smirk off his face. It was a rare thing to see humanity rise from the ashes like this. He intended to savor it, even if it was just for a moment. The irony wasn't lost on him. For all their cunning strategies and last-minute heroics, there was still a cost to pay. The non-existent fleet hadn't sprung out of thin air, and hiding them on the dark side of the moon had taken resources and time that could have been used elsewhere. But as any good magician knew, misdirection was key. And humanity had pulled off one hell of a trick. Veers stood stretching, his spine protesting with a series of pops that sounded like a string of firecrackers. "Well, Sykes, looks like we've got a bit of a break. Fancy that drink?" "Only if you're buying," Sykes replied with a grin. "After today, I think I deserve a top-shelf beverage." Veers laughed, a genuine sound that echoed off the chamber's high domed ceiling. "Sure, why not? Let's celebrate surviving another day in this madhouse." As they left the chamber, Veers couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Humanity, the perennial underdog, had managed to turn the tables on the Zithorics, if only for a moment. But moments like these were precious, and in the cold, uncaring expanse of the universe, they'd take what they could get. In the corridors beyond the chamber, there was a palpable shift among the staff and lesser dignitaries. The way they looked at Veers had changed, from thinly veiled skepticism to an odd mix of respect and wariness. He'd gone from a last-ditch diplomat to something of a legend, a status that felt as comfortable as a new pair of shoes, which is to say, not very. The news of humanity's triumph spread quickly, like a viral meme across the datasphere. Within hours, Veers was fielding calls from several new potential allies. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be humanity's best friend, or at least not their enemy. The Zithorics, once the baddest bullies on the block, had met their match in a species they had long underestimated. Veers couldn't help but indulge in a bit of schadenfreude. There was something deliciously satisfying in watching the overconfident fall flat on their mandibles. Back on Earth, the media was having a field day. "Humanity stands tall," one headline blared, the font practically shouting for joy. "Earth's best trick yet, turning the tables," declared another. The talking heads were all over it, dissecting every detail, every maneuver, as if they were experts who hadn't been doubting the plan just yesterday. Veers knew the truth, though. This wasn't just his victory. It belonged to every person who'd toiled away in the background, making the impossible possible. It was for those who'd believed when belief seemed foolish, and fought when fighting seemed futile. In the days that followed, the Grand Council reconvened, this time with a very different tone. The Zithoric's representative, Zelthar, was conspicuously absent, likely licking his wounds somewhere far from the prying eyes of his peers. In contrast, Veers found himself a minor celebrity, the man of the hour. He used the newfound clout wisely, negotiating deals and forging alliances that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. The council chamber, once a place of anxiety and dread, had become Veers' stage. "Ambassador Veers," began one of the other delegates, a tall, gaunt figure with skin like polished marble, "we are impressed by your unorthodox methods. Perhaps we could discuss a potential partnership." "Of course," Veers replied, the picture of diplomatic composure. "Humanity is always open to new friends, especially when they come bearing gifts," he added with a wink that drew a ripple of laughter from those present. Veers leveraged these opportunities, aware that the galaxy's memory was short and its loyalty is fickle. Today's hero could easily become tomorrow's cautionary tale. Still, there was a certain thrill in the game. Humanity, no longer the underdog, was now a player in the grand galactic drama. Sure, the universe was vast and indifferent, but for once, it seemed to be paying attention. And Veers, with all the cunning of a fox in a henhouse, was ready to seize every advantage. The shifting alliances and newfound respect came with their own brand of chaos. Ambassadors who'd previously avoided him were now lining up for meetings, eager to discuss trade, defense, and the occasional social event. It was dizzying, overwhelming, and yet strangely satisfying. Sykes, ever the voice of reason, kept Veers grounded. "Just remember, Rylan," he said over drinks one evening, "they might love us now, but the galaxy's a fickle place. We're only as good as our last miracle." Veers nodded, the truth of Sykes' words sinking in. "And here I thought I was just getting the hang of this diplomacy thing," he quipped, raising his glass. "Guess we'll have to keep pulling rabbits out of hats. And here I thought you were fresh out of magic tricks," Sykes replied, his smile weary but genuine. "Maybe," Veers said, a hint of mischief in his eyes. But never underestimate a desperate human. For all the newfound alliances and respect, Veers was acutely aware of the challenges ahead. The Zithorics weren't done, not by a long shot. They'd regroup, reassess, and come back with a vengeance. Humanity's moment in the sun was just that, a moment. But it was a moment they'd earned, and it was one they intended to make the most of. The universe, with its vastness and indifference, would always be there, looming like some unknowable beast. But for now, humanity had carved out a space for themselves, a place where their voices could be heard, where their presence could not be ignored. As Veers surveyed the shifting landscape of galactic politics, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They'd done the impossible, turned the tide when everyone had counted them out. They'd proven that humanity, with all its flaws and failings, had a place in the stars. "To the future," Veers said, raising his glass once more, his gaze meeting Sykes. "Whatever the hell it brings." "To the future," Sykes echoed, clinking his glass against Veers. "Let's hope it's got a sense of humor." And with that they drank, celebrating not just their victory but the very essence of what it meant to be human. Defiant, clever, and always ready for whatever came next. In the grand scheme of things, the universe would continue on, vast and uncaring. But for now, humanity had made its mark. They'd faced the darkness and come out the other side, not unscathed but unbowed. And as they looked to the stars, they did so with the knowledge that, while the journey was far from over, they'd shown the galaxy what they were capable of. In the end, that was more than enough.